Hey guys, different format today. As you can see, we're going to take a big deep dive on what it takes to break into tech sales in 2024 and specifically how to nail the interview, because contrary to popular belief out there, yes, it is a different market than 2 years ago, but many people are still breaking in. I've Eric from Higher Levels here. We'll intro him in a second. I'm sure some of you are familiar. We've helped hundreds of people break into tech sales. I think he's uniquely qualified to do this. He has a lot of experience. So we're going to be covering everything from common misconceptions about these interviews so that you're not wasting your time and, quite frankly, just spending a lot of time on things you don't need that aren't serving you in the interview, getting you focused on what you should be focusing on. We're going to cover exact questions you're probably going to get asked, how we might answer, questions you should ask the manager. So 30, 40 minutes here, I don't know how long we'll go. We're going to try and be very concise to the point as to what you actually need to know to nail your tech sales interview. But first, want to kick it over to Eric. I'm sure some of you are familiar, but he's kind enough to invite me out here to Austin to host this type of conversation. So
yeah,
thanks, Eric.
I appreciate you having me on, I guess. But no, just for everyone's reference, I've been in tech sales 5 years now. Previously was an engineer for 3 years, so coming up on about a decade total in tech. But I also transitioned into tech sales after being an engineer for 3 years. And I actually took a gap year and played sports overseas. Maybe something we get into, but maybe a story for another time. So I really started making content about 2 years into my career because I enjoyed the transition. And since then, this has blossomed into something that is way bigger than I expected. We have our YouTube channel, Tech Sales with Higher Levels, and we run higherlevels.com, giving education at like every level of the tech sales career path. But nonetheless, I think just restating why I think we're uniquely qualified to do this, like we've helped hundreds of people break in this year. It's been insane. Like this year alone, when the economy has arguably been the worst, we've had more people break in than the past 2 years combined. But also I think it's just like not only having gone through this myself, having to take a lot of unique experiences that somewhat were related to tech, but I didn't have sales experience. I was all over the place when I was first a candidate, and I know a lot of people watching that are in a similar position themselves watching this video. I think it's just a really good way to update because there's so much noise now. There's way more content than there was when I broke in and first started making content. So I think the whole purpose of this is like, let's tune out all the ideas and let's get focused on like the very core things you need to do, which again, once you have that in place, what we'll talk about, you can get a little bit creative here or there, but I'm sure we'll get into it and I'll cut myself off because I think we're both highly caffeinated. But I think like one of the symptoms I'm seeing now is people get worried about the hype. The job market's tighter than it's ever been. I'm getting to second and third round interviews and I'm failing. And what they start to do is take these like Hail Mary types of chances or do these really like oddball things to stand out, and they mess up what otherwise was a very good process because they're getting away from the fundamentals and they don't have reinforcement that what they're doing is actually very strong. So I think I'll hand it back to you, but it's just like right now, I think more than ever, the market is great. There are still people breaking in at the SDR level consistently, but I also see people freaking out, taking more drastic efforts. And really the goal of this is like, let's just get you centered on what is absolutely most important. You can get creative from there, but let's tune out all the bullshit, all the things about like, well, what if I cold call the manager and give them a 30, 60, 90 and all these different things? Like we're going to walk through this and actually lay out how to do this properly if you do it. So I'll cut myself off.
That was a great overview. There's a lot to unpack, a lot of ways we could take this. And I'm going to try in this conversation too. I've spent, for most of you know, I spent 2 years as an SDR manager. So I've been on the other side of this and think I kind of uniquely know what a lot of these managers are looking for, whether they realize it or not. And like Eric is just saying, it's really nailing the basics. Like a lot of times people, they try and go a little too over the top, think they have to stand out. When
sometimes
really
the best thing you can do is do nothing.
Yes. So we'll unpack this. I think a good place to start on that note is, what are some common misconceptions? So once people, we're assuming you've gotten to the interview at this point, like your resume passed the check, you have a first round interview with a tech sales company you want to work for. What are some common misconceptions you see that people think they need to prepare, or what are you seeing out there that people are just misconceptions about tech sales interviews?
I think it's funny to me. This is for someone that's been trying to break in for a while. I see a lot of people that coming into this first round interview, they want to prepare for every single question in the world. And I'm not knocking the preparation if you have time, but almost every single first round recruiter interview more or less follows the format of, why are you looking into tech sales? why this company specifically.
Yeah.
Those are the only two questions they ask other than tell me about yourself, which I glossed over. But it's literally the format of the first round interview. Tell me about yourself, why tech sales, why this company.
Yeah.
And you can solve 80 to 90% of that interview by like mastering that. And I think a lot of people are like, well, what if they ask about, tell me a time when, or all of these different things? Like, we will get there for sure. But I see so many people that want to prepare for 50 questions. They're Googling on HubSpot. They're in our higher levels platform and they're looking at all the questions that we have that they might get asked throughout the interview process. If you do not have a super sharp, tell me about yourself, why tech sales, why this company, don't bother. Because again, like, we'll break this down and I'll cut myself off here. But when we're specifically looking at this first round, your goal is not just to be like a checkbox, like, okay, like you can really set the tone right out of the gate that you are a top 5% candidate by having a very sharp and compelling story. I know we'll get into the ins and outs of how to actually craft those stories and narratives, but that's the biggest thing, especially with the first round. You want to, hey, should I cold call the manager ahead of time, ahead of my first round interview? It's like, let's pump the brakes. You have secured the first round interview. Let's knock that out of the park. As you get past the second round interview, you get in touch with the manager, whatever it might be. We'll get there and we'll look at that phase. But right now, fundamentally, stop yourself. If you can't, in a 90-second answer, tell me about yourself. If you can't, in a 60-second answer, tell me why tech sales. And if you can't, in a 60-second answer, tell me why this company, and not just regurgitate something you found on the internet, stop. That's what we need to perfect before we worry about anything else. So
I couldn't have said it better myself. If you don't have the answers to those, there's no sense in prepping for all those, like, tell me about a time you worked in a group project and something went wrong and how you overcame that, like these niche questions when you don't have basic answers. Because the first question you're likely going to get asked is something along the lines of, tell me about yourself, what led you to the interview today, things like that. Different questions, different words, but they're all asking the same thing. It's like, show me what you got, show me what you prepared. And if you believe in the power of first impressions, like, you better believe that first answer is going to be arguably the most important answer of the interview, and it can set the tone. Like, you can literally win the interview in that first 2 minutes, like, barring you don't screw anything else up majorly. Like, you can really wow the interviewer. Because I know, having done these interviews, there have been times within the first 2 minutes of the interview, I'm like, this person's getting hired. Like, unless something completely unexpected happens, this kid's on my team. Like, I'm requesting them. Like, it's that level. Like, you can literally win them over. Do we want to get into how we would answer those types of questions? Like, if someone said,
yeah, well, I think basics here for the sake of time. Like, we definitely have content on how to do that in other videos as well. But I think a really powerful thing here is what not to do. Because I think when it's tell me about yourself, people like,
I like where you're taking this.
Like, when it's tell me about yourself, have a compelling story, but also get ahead of the interview. Like, knowing that the format is more or less going to be tell me about yourself, why tech sales, why this company. It is okay to allude to that in your tell me about yourself answer. And like, without going into full details of what I would answer over 90 seconds, basically my story, student athlete in college, very competitive, got into engineering and realized I didn't like it because I got paid the same no matter how hard I worked, decided to try and qualify for the Olympics one more time. And after that was done, realized that tech sales was the next step for me. And specifically, I saw this opportunity at Oracle. You guys are a market leader, you have training, you're notorious for training reps and building their career, X, Y, and Z. And the simple way that I structured that answer has given the recruiter tons of different things they can ask about, but I've narrowed the field into like, wow, one, that was a super strong answer. I'd love to know more about your athletic or your engineering experience or your customer facing experience that you got in engineering. But you, by having a very strong answer and really tailoring it to the format of the interview, you're just guiding the recruiter along the way. And it's funny because I see people who are like, well, I don't want to give too much. I don't want to answer those questions ahead of time. It's like, yes, you do. Because if you do this effectively, you've just knocked out the recruiter's like, this person's on the ball. Here's I already have everything I need to know. I'm not even worried about it anymore. Now I'll get to know them on a more personal level, and I can really upsell them to the manager internally. So that's all I'd say without going too deep in the sauce.
No, guys, that's exactly how it's done. Like, no matter, you're going to get some form of question like that. You just don't know what it's going to be. It could be tell me about yourself, what led you to the interview. They could just go into why sales. it should be empowering to you to know that you know exactly how the first 90 seconds to 2 minutes of that interview is going to go if you've prepared. Because no matter what variation of that question you get asked, you want to make sure you're tying in those answers and that you've showed up prepared. I think what a lot of people do and is a mistake is they take that question as yes, you can give a little bit about your background like you just did in engineering and a little bit about what led you here, but you very quickly got into why tech sales and why this company specifically. A lot of people take this as an opportunity to so I like skiing and I also like to play basketball, and it's like, save that for after you get the job. Show them you understand. Usually it's 30 minutes, maybe it's 45, but you have a very limited amount of time to impress them. And this is the first question. You want to show you understand what your job is here and why, what you're doing here, and that you came prepared and aren't going to waste any of that time talking about your hobbies or things like that. Save that for after you get the job. This is your chance to blow them out of the water. And yeah, whatever question they ask you, I think you want to tie in, what specifically about yourself made you think you wanted to go into a sales career? I'd even take it a step further and show, why do you want to go into tech sales? There's lots of different industries you can work in. You can talk about what excites you about the industry in general, and then talk about why you're applying to this company specifically, because you've done some research, ideally, on their website about what type of market position they have and why they have a good fit in the market and why that's exciting to you. Yeah. That's kind of the 3-step formula to me, is give a little bit of background about yourself, 15 seconds max, then get into why you wanted to go into sales, why you wanted to do so in the tech industry, and why you're excited about this company particularly. Yeah. And what you'll find, what you said about interviewers, you gave them so much to work with when you answer all of that out of the gate. A lot of times they have prepared questions they're supposed to ask, but if you nail that first answer, you'll get them to go completely off script and start asking about the things you've said, and now you're in control of the interview. It's a great spot to be. But before you focus on any of that other niche stuff, you want to be rehearsing that answer over and over and over again, so you know exactly what you're doing once the Zoom starts and they say, tell me about yourself.
Yeah. Anyway, I think that's enough on that point. Yeah. I forget what our next point was as well, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess now it's what should reps be focused? If those are the misconceptions and people, we talked about a little of those questions you want to be focused on. What are some of the other things reps should be focusing on throughout the interview process to get the most out of the time?
Yeah, I think beyond the recruiter interview, as you go to the SDR manager, at this point in my mind, it's a non-negotiable to reach out to people in the company. You should at least connect with a current or former SDR, ideally multiple current SDRs. But I think that should inform your process. You should try to find people that can advocate for you on your behalf. And even if nothing else, they'll inform you about what the manager's like, what their process is. And I did this when trying to break into both tech sales and med device. I quickly realized med device wasn't for me, but I did the same process. I cold called a rep there before and cold emailed him, and we had a 15-minute conversation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's now we're getting away from, and this is the uncomfortable part, because I think the academically smart person or the driven person is going to have very strong answers. But now, and I've seen this repeatedly, we have several very high IQ types of people joining the higher levels platform, and they get their answers down. They get the initial outreach and application down because they went to a strong school or they have a particularly unique background. But now they get to these middle and final round interviews and they're not multi-threading in ways that they could to make themselves stand out. So even if it's reaching out to the manager proactively, if there's a line of communication beforehand, I don't want to get into this, and I'm not saying this is a requirement. If you're not introduced to the manager, I think it can almost look like weakness if you reach out ahead of time. But if you're not reaching out to other SDRs, other people at this company to try and understand their experience at the company, what it was like, what they can expect from an interview and just management style perspective, those are things where you're really shooting yourselves in the foot. And aside from any answer that's going to make you stand out, I would say this is probably the biggest thing people don't do that they misfire on is multi-threading in the company. But I'm curious your thoughts.
That was literally the main thing I would say. It just, again, demonstrates your level of preparation, and you're doing the job before the job itself. That's kind of what you're doing in the SDR role when you're trying to break into some of these companies, get some qualified pipeline. You talk to as many people as you can, oftentimes at the lower levels, and use that information once you meet with the executives. I don't know if managers are consciously thinking that, but it's like a vibe almost, this person's doing things that I'm not seeing other candidates do. Oh, they talked to Joe or they talked to Sydney. Whoa, other candidates aren't doing that. anything you can do to signal you're going above and beyond and demonstrating your level of preparation. I think that's one of the hidden ways people don't really think about. And a lot of those SDRs too, they were in your shoes a year ago. They're happy to get on calls, or maybe they're pretty new to the company. Like a lot of these people, if you reach out to 10 or 15, yeah, some people might tell you to take a hike and not be interested, but that's all you need is one or two to be able to go into an interview and say, I talked to so-and-so, here's what I learned, and use that throughout your interview. So, and yeah, that's a great point. And I guess building on that, once you are in front of that hiring manager, what do you think are the most important qualities as a candidate that you want to be indicating or emphasizing to the manager in order to land a role?
Yeah, I think on one hand, especially if you have no tech sales experience, that's not a blocker at all. Like if you have an interview, they're interested enough in talking to you. So I think on one hand, showing that you've done research and you know the industry and what a tech sales role actually is, it like can't be stressed enough, because what that communicates to me is you're going to be hands off. You're going to like, I'm not going to have to micromanage you to like get you to do well. And also I think it shows that like, regardless of your background, if you don't have credentials, you're absolutely willing to put in the work. Or on the flip side, if you're like highly credentialed and have a prototypical background, there's people who slip through the cracks and have that like good school or that good GPA, and they had an easy major or they did these different things that still doesn't, like once they're in the interview, if I can tell they're kind of lazy and just like don't really try that hard, that's a big red flag for me. And probably the biggest thing is I want to see that at least you've done a lot of research, even if it's not perfect, to like actually know what you're talking about. And then obviously I think somewhat basics of like being coachable and things of that nature. I don't know, except with the exception of examples of like you playing on sports teams or, you know, I don't know, doing a project for your professor or something in school or whatever it might be. There are ways you can communicate that in the recruiter interview, but I think that's most important as you get into the second, third round with sales managers. Anytime you're getting feedback, you know, clarifying things, not just taking it and being like, oh, thanks, that makes sense. But like, that makes a lot of sense. This is what I was thinking. How would you do it differently? And then if you're given opportunities to like redo mock cold calls as an example, like implementing that feedback like right away.
That's huge.
So yeah, those are two of the biggest things that stand out.
And a side point on that, because I want to share the qualities I look for too, and it overlaps a lot with yours, but I don't even know if we're going to touch on it in this conversation, but when it comes to the cold call role play, a lot of reps overthink it, that they're being judged on how good that first time out of the gate their cold call role play is, when in reality, in my opinion, that's more of an exercise to determine a candidate's coachability. Because the role play, I've done so many of these, it's so hard to mimic a cold call in a role play. They almost all sound bad, and you're going to give some feedback like, handle this objection, like when I throw this at you, say this, or change your opener to this. And they really just want to see, can this person take the feedback and apply it? Are they coachable? That's huge. And the way I try and coach and break this down to candidates personally is the three qualities I think they should emphasize, just to keep it simple, because I think any manager should be looking for these, is that you're a hard worker, you're coachable like we just talked about, and that you're a team player. And one I interchange is adaptability. You could even emphasize that, but if you are prepared, knowing that those are important qualities, you can weave those into any of your answers. Like if you get asked, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Or like, why do you think you'd be a good fit for a sales role? You can call on those three, and you want to have at least one individual unique story prepared for a time you went the extra mile and worked hard, or a time you maybe were slow to start at something, took feedback, applied it, and became a lot better. Or team player, because it's very much a team job. Yes, you have a manager, you're making calls on your own, emails on your own, but you work within an account executive, there's other internal stakeholders. Yeah. So to keep it simple, I try and get reps prepared to, those are the three I like to focus on. If you're a hard worker, so that I don't have to micromanage you, or that when I'm not in the room, I know you're hustling, that when I give you feedback and invest time in you, that you're gonna take that, get better, and then when you do get better, you're a team player, you think there's more than enough room for everyone to succeed. I think those are winning qualities that any smart manager at least should be looking for.
Yeah, and I think before we go to the next topic, like one thing I just want to reiterate here is we haven't talked, like I think it's really important to make this distinction. It's hard to understand in like short form content, or if you see a LinkedIn post of like 3 tips on how to interview. Like we have not once talked about cold calling a manager. We have not talked about, should you give a manager a 30, 60, 90? Should you do account planning and send that ahead of time? Like these are all things you can do, but if this frame is like missing, you know, if you haven't communicated these things correctly, literally the same document that you send from Connor might be very well received because he's been on the ball. He's been ahead of time. He told me he reached out to 3 SDRs in the first interview we had, and coming into this final round, he sent me an account plan to show me he's well beyond prepared for this interview. And that is very well received. Now, the flip side is if I'm on the outside looking in, I've had a questionable interview. I'm getting put through because I've got a decent background, and maybe, with the feedback we provided him from the first round, he'll do better this time. And I didn't reach out to an SDR. I saw a YouTube video about how to make a 30-60-90, and I just send them a 30-60-90 because I saw some student from higher levels send a 30-60-90, and that sealed the deal for them. It's going to be seen as desperation. It's probably not going to be done with any proper context. And when you otherwise would have gotten and come into that interview and been at least like neutral, viewed as neutral, if you send a dog shit 30-60-90 that has nothing to do with the role, now coming into the interview, you got an even bigger hill to climb to just get back to baseline, let alone actually exceed the interview. So I just wanted to call that out because this sounds very meta, but this is where I think people mess up the most is they're focusing on these little tasks. Yep. Should I do this? Should I do this? Well, have you created a narrative and body language and everything end to end that communicates these traits and demonstrates your ability to do the job? Yep. And that gets very meta very quickly, but I think it's just worth calling out again.
Yeah, so spot on. It's a great call out. Yep. If you don't nail the basics, if you don't tell that good narrative about why you're here, why you want to go in sales, and why at this company, it doesn't matter how incredible your 30-60-90 was, there's going to be this little piece in the manager's head, and I know because I've done these, where it's they weren't prepared for why sales. How are they going to prepare on the job? Yeah. That's the point of these questions. Is there's always the question itself, but then the underlying question of what the manager is actually asking. When they say, tell me about yourself, the underlying question is, how well did you prepare for this interview? Because the first 90 seconds are going to tell them everything they need to know about that. Yep. Doesn't matter if you nail your cold call role play. Maybe you'll get by, but there's going to be that piece of the manager that's okay, that was a little off in the beginning. All right, I guess now we're through a good chunk of the interview. And again, it's just nailing the basics here. So now we're at the end of the interview. Let's call it the last 5 minutes. There's a few things. I would argue that these last 5 minutes are the next most important part of the interview besides that first 90 seconds to 2 minutes, because now it's likely going to be your time to ask the manager questions. They're going to say, do you have any questions for me? And there's some other things you can do at the end of the interview. So I guess, do you want to take it, where would you start with telling a rep on how to handle that last 5 minutes once the manager's all right, we've covered everything. What questions do you have for me? Yeah,
I think, this changes at different levels. I won't necessarily get into the enterprise side because I do think at the enterprise level, your standard questions for them and then closing the interview, actually in a strange way, it almost looks like, I'm not going to say bad, but it's not as expected on the enterprise side because if you've been in the industry for the 5 to 10 years it takes to get to that level, people aren't expecting you to close every conversation per se. Those deal cycles are way longer, et cetera, et cetera. Specifically for the SDR or inside sales rep, you have to close the interview. Basics here, 3 questions maximum. Yep. If you have prepare 5 questions. Based on how the conversation goes, you're picking 3 of them at most. If you ask, lead with your best question by far. If that sparks a great conversation and back and forth with Connor, who's the SDR manager, just keep riding that. If I ask a question of hey, I reached out to Sally and Joe and whoever, and they told me that you were a great manager, they came in and didn't know much, what are some of the biggest gaps that you see with people like myself with, fresh out of school or getting their first sales job that don't have experience? What are the biggest areas that you attack when coaching someone, right? Mm-hmm. That's an example of a question, not even saying it's the best one, but let's say you light up because you really enjoy the coaching aspect of being a manager. I'm just gonna keep riding that thread. I'm not gonna stop you and say what would be the biggest thing I need to learn coming into the, it's anyway, so 3 really good questions there. And then obviously, keep your eyes on the clock. If it is 29 and your interview ends at 30, just be hey, I actually realize we're going over on time. I'm happy to stay if you have more, but at the same time, I do want to check if there's any hesitations you have of moving me forward to the next process before we end this call.
Yep.
Point blank them, and then just don't say a word.
Yep.
Do not say a word. I know we talked about this on a episode we had on my channel, but it's funny. It's people who haven't prepared this, who haven't said it out loud, I want to be super OCD and anal about this because people miss this. They do this for the first time when they're live in the call, and they think they're going to ask it direct like I just did, but how it actually comes out is like, hey, Connor, like I want to be conscious of time. I really enjoyed our conversation. And prior to this, they weren't stumbling, they weren't nervous at all. And then they get to this point and they're like, I was just wondering, before we end this call, like if you had any, hesitations, or if you had anything that you felt like wouldn't allow you to move me forward to the next round. And if you don't practice this and actually say it out loud, it comes off very weak. And you're more or less asking the same question, but hopefully that shows you the difference between, hey, Connor, I really enjoyed this conversation. I know we've got about a minute left, and I'm happy to stay long if you want to, but I did want to check before this call ends if you have to go, if you had any concerns about moving me on to the next round.
Yep. Mic drop.
That's it. And you don't say a word, and you just wait.
Yep.
And it's amazing how simple that seems when you see this on the podcast, but how many people in real time don't practice this enough to deliver that flawlessly. And that is the difference between you and the student athlete from, I don't know, some state school, or the D2 basketball player that they want to take a chance on. That's the difference between you and that person getting the job. Yep. You delivering it that crisp. And I just can't stress that enough.
We teach a lot. We didn't even talk about this offline, but we teach a lot of the same principles. Those are the exact numbers you use too. I tell reps, prepare 5 questions. Do not ask 5 questions. Ask 3 max. Because I've been that manager at the end of an interview where a rep just asks questions, and I think the rep thinks they're showing interest when they're doing that, but you're on question 7 and you're like, is this what it's going to be like managing you? Like, are you going to ask me a million questions like this? So you want to, I think, again, demonstrate your level of preparation in those questions. You don't want to ask questions that fall flat. Like, can you tell me a little bit more about the role? You more want to tell them, like, here's the research I've done at the role. Here are the people I've talked to within the company. What else am I missing to make sure that you would recommend I know and understand so that I ramp up into role as quickly as possible? That's just like one example question, but those are the types of questions I recommend. And then, closing the interview at the end. I know when I coach SDRs, I preach the same thing, like, keep it simple. You can have a smile on your face. You can say, I guess my last question is based on our discussion today. Do you think I would be a good fit for the SDR role at X company or on your team? And then just shut up. One line, you don't need to overthink it. It's hard when you don't prepare, though, to say it with conviction like that. So you want to practice in advance, but it's just doing the basics here. And then one other little quick tip I always add is, if you're going to send a follow-up to the manager, which I do recommend, tee up a template beforehand so that you can send it out within 30 minutes, because a lot of times managers have to make a call very quickly. So if you wait till the end of the day to send some form of follow-up, it might have been too late. Like, maybe you got the job anyway, but it didn't impact that decision. So just have some template that's like, thank them for the time, remind them let them know what you learned on the call. You probably took some notes, remind them why you're a good fit, and then tell them you're looking forward to next steps. And if you just do that, 3 good questions, close them with 1 simple line, follow up, you're putting yourself above 90% of candidates, because most people aren't doing that. Yeah,
really well said. Actually, something I just want to reiterate that I haven't said myself is absolutely, like, there's been students that we've had, and even Chris, co-founder of Higher Levels, that got rejected from an SDR position when they broke in because they didn't send a follow-up. Like, that is another thing that's you have to do. That's like table stakes. If you're not doing that, don't even worry about it. But to your point, if you prepare ahead of time, you prepare a 2 or 3 sentence email that was like, hey, enjoyed the conversation today. Really felt like I got to know a lot more about Oracle and the SDR role and why it stands out compared to the other opportunities I have. Looking forward to next steps. And that's just something I ripped off my head, but like short, sweet, to the point, still personalized enough to where it's like you give them a feeling that you got a lot out of their time as well. Not just you trying to leech off them and get the job. Like, these are like basics that people don't do. It's amazing how many people don't do it. So.
And now we're through a 30-minute interview. Like, those are what you need to nail. Like, I see multiple hour-long videos on YouTube about what it takes to land a tech sales job, when in reality it's really just nailing these basics and doing it really well. And then, yes, if you have the extra capacity, once you have this stuff down and want to start preparing yourself for some more niche situations or learning more about the technicals, we didn't really get into that. That's something I think reps overthink sometimes, is how much technical knowledge they need to understand specifically for an SDR interview. You usually don't need it, but like, if you have the extra capacity, focus on that stuff. But until you have the stuff we talked about today nailed down, like, that's where you should be focusing your time and effort first. So
100%. Yeah, and I'd say again, it's like, there's tons of great content on YouTube, and like, the whole purpose of why we even started making content is to like make this more accessible to people. But I also would say on the flip side, I think a symptom of how popular tech sales is as a career now is you have everyone in the world talking about what you should do. And so it's like that's a necessity of why we even created Higher Levels in the first place. We had people reaching out to us both asking for live coaching. So we also have live coaching, but we also pair that with like pre-recorded, to the point of this conversation, like bare bones essentials of exactly what you need to do to execute. Because again, we have seen people that have taken our content and had success themselves, and we're all for that. But also for someone who's looking for like, hey, I've just taken in so much shit, I don't even know where to start. I just literally want step 1, step 2, and basically be told exactly these are the steps I should take, paired with live coaching. Like that is why we created Higher Levels. Like it wasn't for anything other than the fact that people kept asking us this stuff over and over again, and kept asking us for live coaching and all these different things. So I just wanted to call that out. Like I think so many people overcomplicate this. I know there's a lot of like shitty programs out there. Obviously I'm confident in what we do. We have the results to back it up. But I think that's the other piece of this is like, if you can get by listening to this content, like absolutely go for it. But if you are looking for direct guidance and direct coaching along the way, that's why Higher Levels exists. So
in the pinned comment below to Tech Sales Ascension, this is where we help people break in, because totally agree. Like the content is out there, but if you want to make sure every hour that you're spending towards getting a tech sales job is actually focused on the things you need to know, that's the place to do it. So hope to see you in there. Eric as well, thank you for the time today and hosting me in this beautiful new apartment. Excited to do more of these. So hope you guys got value out of this one, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you guys.